anyone who says kids today was once a kid. And that we know that Cicero, around, about 2,000 years ago, complained about kids today and their terrible Latin and the way that, and so that we know that that has always existed, this kind of complaining. And linguists will tell you that there's no such thing. We don't observe any reduction. And this age of and, this age of also, exposes us to more media. And the written word and our written expression is more important today than it ever was, because that might be the only face we show a certain public.
We're talking about the printed word and books tonight. I was just back in the WGBH archives back here, where we got all these film reels, and there were these two carpenter ants chewing through one of the reels, like gnawing at it. And one of the carpenter ants turned to the other carpenter ant and he said, "Kind of like the book better." Horrible, boo. All right.
I basically wanted to do a couple of different things about teenagers and reading and the kinds of books we call books and how we recommend books. As a librarian, I do a lot of different things. Most libraries you'll hear about now, all the kind of big buzzwords are things like 3D printing and makerspaces and all of the things that make libraries community centers. But I don't want people to lose track of the fact that we are ultimately about stories, and that's the most key thing that we can connect people with. So for my day today, I went from demonstrating 3D printing in the morning to giving a class of English language learning students introductions to magical realism as a genre and trying to find books that they could read. And then now I'm here. So the major thing I wanted to talk about is the idea of to not prejudge what people read and to not forget that books are every kind of thing. They're every kind of story. And when I talk to teenagers, when I deal with teenagers, there's a sense of stereotypes around them. There's that idea that teenagers don't read anymore, when in fact, if you look at the Pew surveys about reading, teenagers are the most likely age group to read, and it goes down from there. The actually least likely to read are seniors. So I think it's interesting that people forget that teenagers read a lot, and for them, format matters less, genre matters less. You just have to pitch it as a good book. And I like the fact that they are easy to convince, in the sense of you can personally sell a book to a teenager really easily. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the idea of the different formats of stories. I do a lot of work with comics and graphic novels, and since around 1999-2000, they've been coming up as a popular medium in the book world and in the library world especially. And I think there's a sense of how people find books, the stories that connect. You'll hear a lot of librarians talk in the world about the importance of two kinds of books. Books that provide windows, so they show you other people, they let you empathize with other people and see something different from yourself. And books that are mirrors, that show you back to yourself, that show you something that you see as yours, that you can recognize. And I work with teenagers mainly because at that age is when books have the biggest impact. The right story at the right time makes you who you are. It makes you just figure out who you are. It makes you figure out who you're not. And how many of you remember your favorite book when you were 12? So that's the book. That's the book that means the most. Whereas you tend not to remember as easily your favorite book when you were 23. So there's a difference of how the impact works. And I always think about the different kids I see every day. We have a lot of kids that come in every day that are not obviously readers. They come in after school, they hang out, they use the computers, they play games with each other, all of that kind of stuff. But they also are paying attention, and they are looking at the shelves, and they will ask me about books. They come to trust me as a person, so they will ask me for recommendations. It's my favorite thing to do. But what I love are the kids that you don't expect, who come up and suddenly kind of express an interest in reading. There's one young man I always think of who is a guy who comes in all the time. He's often there for hours at a time, 6-7 hours for over the day, especially on the weekends. And he's clearly using the library as a safe haven and as a place that's kind of his refuge from the rest of the world. But he's usually in there using the computers, talking to his friends, doing his homework. He's not always obviously a book person. But then one day he came up to me and he's like, "Have you heard about this book called March?" And he was talking about a book called March by Congressman John Lewis about his memoir of growing up and coming of age in the South and becoming part of the civil rights movement. And he's, of course, a congressman now. And he had no idea this book existed. Now, this is a graphic novel. When the congressman was trying to figure out how to tell his story, his aide, Andrew, suggested he write it as a comic because he knew how popular they were and how much it would get that story across. And so they combined together, the congressman and Andrew, and a comics artist named Nate Powell decided to write the story. There are 2 volumes now. But this young man came up and he's like, do you know anything about this? And I said, oh yeah, that's John Lewis. He was a huge deal. He still is a huge deal. And I was like, what did you think about it? Did you get to read it? And he went on for about 10 minutes about how much he learned and how much he was amazed that there was someone that looked like him that had done this. And then we talked about Selma, and we talked about all the different things that he had learned. And he had this kind of wonderful look, and he was so excited that I knew what he was talking about, that I was as excited as he was. And then I was able to say, well, there's a second volume, right? And he was like, what? And I was like, it's right over here. So I took him right over, pulled it off the shelf. He sat down and started reading. And that's the thing you have to remember, is that the right book is the most important thing. And for those kids, that's what they need to find themselves. I always call for, there's always room for more stories. As a librarian, I'm always looking for the stories that aren't being told, that need to be told. Teenagers, again, totally don't care about the trends. They don't care about what they're told to read. They will read what they want, and they will read what they want to see. And if they don't see it, they'll start to create it. That's another way comics come into it. A lot of kids become artists because they want to show the world what they want to see next. So I think all of those things come together in the library. And that's my major pitch. So I would say, if someone asks you for a book recommendation, when parents come in, a lot of the time, they'll say, can you recommend a book for my son or my daughter or my niece or whoever? And I'll say, okay, well, tell me about them. And they'll say, oh, well, they're a 13-year-old boy. And that's all they tell me. And I'm like, that actually doesn't help me at all. Just a gender and an age means nothing about what you like to read. So I just encourage everyone to be really adventurous and not to prejudge things. If someone really pitches a book to you because they love it, give it a chance and try to read it. If it's something you don't normally read, stretch a little bit and see if it's a genre you don't like. Give it a shot. There's a reason that person loved it, and you can expand your universe a little bit. So that's my pitch.
Right.
So.
Here, I'm going to step in for
yes.
Give it up for Robin. That was great. Yeah, nice job.
Sure.
So, Robin, when we were upstairs, we were talking. You said on any given day about how many students will come by the Brookline Library?
Yeah, it's about 20 to 50 teenagers per day in the room.
That it was that many.
We have a great room. So we have a diner booth and a TARDIS. So.
That's
so all of those things are good.
And you said that the right book is what's most important. It's not gender, it's not age. When you were 12 years old, what was the book for you?
The books that I loved at that age were the fantasy novels about girls becoming knights. Things like Tamora Pierce, that was actually a little earlier. But I'd never wanted to be a princess, despite the fact that I have my fancy dress today.
And the earrings.
Yeah,
the earrings.
And I've got my Captain America earrings. So it's very much, I didn't understand the girly girl princess stuff, and I really wanted to be the knight, and that was the first time I saw that I could be.
That's great.
So also my mom.
What are you most surprised by? What kids are reading today? Is there one book that you think people here would be surprised by that's popular down the road in Brookline?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of books that the kids read that they like. What I think I always am surprised that people don't understand is that kids read a lot more complicated books than they are given credit for.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of really smart and interesting books that are the kind of things people think are too hard or think that the kids are going to get bored.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry Potter taught the world that everyone reads long books, and that's not a problem if you like the story. So,
right.
So for me, there's a lot of really great longer young adult novels that are considered not good because they're young adult, but in fact they're just as complicated as any adult book, and they have plot.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks. Give it up for Robin one more time. There you go.
I just wanted to give you a really quick overview of the industrialization of bookbinding in the 19th century. I know, fascinating topic. Now, when the 19th century began, the production of books had changed very little in the past 300 years. So paper was still handmade, type was set by hand using little individual pieces of metal type, and printing presses were wood. To become a bookbinder, you would spend years apprenticing and then becoming a journeyman before you finally became a master. Now, all that changed over the next 30 years between 1800 and 1830. They developed a machine for making paper. It was a continuous paper-making machine. It would just crank out an endless stream of paper. So paper became much more plentiful. They also introduced a metal press to print with, to replace wooden presses. And the metal press was much more durable. It didn't fluctuate with temperature and humidity the same way that wood did. It was just very reliable. And then instead of printing every book with hand-set type, they started to stereotype book pages for printing. And what that meant was they would still set up the page with hand-set individual pieces of type, but then they would take a form of that, create a mold, and create plates that they could print from, very thin plates. And this allowed them to reprint books very easily because they could store the plates, reset their type, and print those plates anytime they felt like it. So they all of a sudden started to put out just massive amounts of printed material that bookbinders would have to try to bind. So bookbinding became this kind of bottleneck for the industry of publishing books. And so what they did around 1830 was they introduced a new structure called the case binding. Now, I'm sure all of you, whether you know it or not, are familiar with this book. If you've ever seen a hardcover book, it's most likely case bound. So it's been very enduring technology for the past 180 plus years. What case binding allowed them to do was to create texts separate from covers and then put them together by gluing them at the very end. So if you want to think about it, it's kind of like interchangeable parts. You create a stack of texts over here, you create a stack of covers over here, and at the very end, any book from the text, any cover from the pile of covers will match each other and will work. Now, this allowed them to break bookbinding down into these individual, simpler steps. And they then were able to hire people who were not skilled. You could take and grab someone off the street in 2 hours. You could teach them how to do a certain step in bookbinding, and they would become a bookbinder. They would become your employer. So if you're going to hire unskilled people, you're going to hire women because they were just much cheaper. I had nothing to do with this, so don't blame me. They were just more affordable. So they began to hire a lot of women to try to crank out as many books as they could, bind as many books as they could. So women would typically fold printed sheets, they would collate all those sheets, and they would sew sheets. They would do a bunch of other things in the bindery, smaller tasks, leaving the very manly things to men. They did things that didn't require as much physical brute strength. So if you think about it, a 320-page book, which is a normal size book, would probably have 20 printed signatures in it. And each signature would have 16 pages in that signature that when you folded it up would make sense with page 1 coming first, page 16 at the end. So if you did 1,000 copies of this book, that means you'd have 20,000 printed sheets of paper that needed to be folded. Now, these would have to be folded multiple times in order to get the proper format of the book into 16 pages. So you'd have to fold each sheet 3 times. So for this one book, you'd have to make 60,000 folds. Now, I don't know any guy that's going to sit around and make that many folds. We just get distracted very easily. So they would have women folding these signatures down, and then at the end, they would be left with 20,000 signatures or sections, parts of a book that really weren't connected to any other part of the book. So they would have these stacks of 1,000 sheets, 20 of them. So the women would go around and they would pick each one of the signatures from each one of the stacks to complete a book. Then the book would have to be sewn by hand using thread, every one of those signatures. So another 20,000 signatures had to be sewn. So really, the bulk of bookbinding was contained in those 3 things. So again, women did most of that. By 1860, the largest bindery in New England was located in Boston. You can't find it anymore because they tore the whole area down and put up the government center, which seemed like a good idea at the time, I'm sure. In that bindery, 75% of the employees were women. Only 25% were men. Now, the men did have an advantage in that they made a little over $10 a week. The women made about $3 a week. So you could see the advantage in employing women. And in fact, it was economically more feasible to have women do these activities than to develop machines to do them. For instance, the first sewing machine was developed in America in the mid-1860s, but it really wasn't practically used for at least another 20 years because it was more expensive to purchase that machine and try to run it than it was to have women sew all these books by hand. So if you've ever seen a book from the 19th century, the chances are it was sewn by hand and it was done by a woman. Now, it sounds kind of depressing, especially if you were a woman in the 19th century, and I don't want to leave you that way. I think something good came of this. Just like women who worked in other factories, I'm sure you've heard a lot about, the women who worked in the textile mills. Women started to have disposable income from doing this. They started to become a market force, and publishers then started to market books towards women. So you got books with titles like Leaflets of Memory, or The Golden Gift, or The Token. Things that appealed and were marketed directly to women, purchased by women, and quite often given to other women. They would be called gift books, kind of as a genre. So that meant they needed people to write for these books. So you had more women authors who were doing poetry, they were doing short stories, they were doing moral lessons. So you had women who were making books, women who were buying books, women who were writing books. And I think, it also gave them other opportunities eventually. But really, machinery, in terms of creating books as a whole, in terms of the machine-made book, didn't really happen until the beginning of the 20th century. Just because it wasn't economically feasible, it was too difficult to make these things happen. So, thank you.
That was great talk. That was great. So, I'm fascinated. As someone who covers higher education, I'm fascinated that you go down to UVA in the summer, right, and you teach this course, right? Who's taking this course at a time when the most popular course, right, at Harvard is coding, is computer science 101? Who's taking a course in bookbinding?
Well, and I say this in all sympathy, book nerds. It's like summer camp for book nerds. And I've taken many courses there myself. I think I've taken 7 different courses. And it's an opportunity to fully immerse yourself in the study. The classes meet from 8:30 to 5, Monday through Friday. So it's 30 contact hours. There's lectures every evening. There's other programming. Mm-hmm. It is really a chance to kind of be an adult and go to summer school.
And it's at the Rare Book School at UVA, right?
It's Rare Book School at UVA.
And what are some of the rare books that they have down there?
They have a collection of more than 30,000 rare books that support their teaching. So they would have anything from medieval manuscripts right up to probably ebooks. Someone teaches the history of the book, and of course, now if you're going to teach the history of the book, you have to put the ebook on the end.
Interesting. Quick poll. How many people read on an ebook now more than they read on a printed page? Looks like you're going to stay in business. I think you're good. You're in good shape.
Well, notice it's the older people.
It's the older
reading
people,
on
right?
the ebook.
Yeah, that was great. All right. That's right. And do you think that's part of it? Is it the weight? Is that what's gonna sink the book ultimately?
Well, I don't think anything's going to sink the book. I mean, the book has been around for a millennium. I mean, if you think about it, the ancient Egyptians had scrolls. People have always had this need to put information down and to share it with other people. And I think that's the basis of, who we are as humans. We want to share information. We want to learn from each other. And so whether it's an ebook or it's a printed book or it's a manuscript that you wrote yourself and just give to your friends. that's never going to go away.
That was great. Give it up for Todd, all right?
Thanks, Todd.
That was great. Thank you so much.
I thought we'd talk about the dictionary as an object, as a book to start with. And the two names that the company has, and a lot of people really don't think about, it's Merriam-Webster. Webster obviously was the author, that he wrote the dictionary. The Merriams were the printers. And so that gets right to what Todd was talking about, to the process, the 19th century process of making dictionaries. And this has everything to do with the fact that I have a job today, because Webster wrote dictionaries, but he didn't sell them. In fact, when he first wrote his great 1828 dictionary, it cost $20. Now, in 1828, $20 could buy you a grandfather clock. So it was a luxury item. It wasn't something that everybody could buy. And when he died, big surprise, with a lot of stock that was not sold. And the Merriams were printers in Springfield, Massachusetts, where we still are, by the way, since 1831. And they took over the stock, and it sold well. And then they said, you know, this is kind of a nice little business. Why don't we keep going? And then they started revising. But what they did when they revised is they changed something. They changed the price. The first Merriam edition, 1847, was $6. So you can see already what they decided to do was to sell more books. And then they decided, well, the Webster's Dictionary was a big, fat book, and we can make it smaller and sell it for less money. They invented something that you've probably heard of called the Collegiate Dictionary, which was the abridgment of the big Webster's unabridged dictionary, and that cost $3 in 1898. How many of you have a collegiate dictionary? A lot of you do, yeah. You still have it, right, from when you were in high school or college. And a lot of you do, and I know that because it's the best-selling hardcover book in American history after the Bible. And so there's a lot of them out there, and I know that people connect with that book. But then the Merriams also innovated in 1947. They invented the first paperback dictionary, the little, like the airport novel-sized dictionary, and that cost 25 cents. So you can see a pattern here of getting more affordable and getting more accessible. And finally, in 1996, we put the dictionary online, and we put it online for free. Some of you know this, I assume, that you might use the dictionary online. Please do. And so the question becomes, if we've had this direct line from expensive to free, the Merriam's mission was distribution, was the most radical kind of distribution, to sell as many books as they could, and then to make the information as accessible as possible. We make our money, obviously, through the advertising. Now, the big difference with the digital dictionary is that I now know what words you're looking up. Now, in the old days, if you think about the work of a dictionary editor, a lexicographer, you could spend, I can tell you from firsthand experience, you could spend an afternoon or a day or a week on a definition. And so I might spend all that time and never know if anyone ever read it. And we have a couple of anecdotes from those days. Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, who wrote the famous dictionary in London in 1755, when that was completed, he was congratulated, and a woman from society said, "I'm so pleased that you have omitted the naughty words." To which Dr. Johnson is supposed to have replied, "Madam, I find that you have been looking them up." So we see an evidence here, evidence of what we call a lookup, evidence that somebody was curious about a word. Now, something happened again around 1900 when the great project was going on in Oxford. The Oxford English Dictionary was begun, and the editor of that dictionary was using the Oxford faculty as consultants. And a word was brought to the dictionary, and he saw that it was a medical word. He sent it to the medical faculty, and he asked, should we add this word to the New English Dictionary? And the answer came back, absolutely not. This is a very specific, abstruse word. Only a certain kind of surgeon would know this word, so don't put it in the dictionary. So he didn't. And then the single greatest story of the entire 20th century took place. This was 1901. The Queen died, Queen Victoria. And so there was going to be a coronation, and the Prince of Wales was going to be the next king. The problem is the Prince of Wales became suddenly and gravely ill. He became so ill, in fact, that they had to delay the coronation, and so ill that it was actually feared that he might die. And suddenly you had the entire nation very curious about one word, about the word that named the condition of the Prince of Wales. And unfortunately, that was the word that was dropped by the editor who was asked to put it in and then decided not to. The word was appendicitis. So we know that there is curiosity that can be drawn in this way. Now, when we put the dictionary online in 1996, we had no business model. We looked at the words and we said, oh, that's kind of interesting. There's a list of words. This is what people are curious about. Then something happened. In 1997, the first news event that was widely shared online was the death of Princess Diana. And all of a sudden, that list of words changed. They changed very quickly. And the words were paparazzi and cortege. And interestingly, the word princess itself was looked up. And then, for example, 9/11 happened. The first words immediately were concrete words of destruction, rubble and triage. And then a couple of days later, the words that were looked up were political words, terrorism, jingoism. And then a couple of days later, the words that were looked up were the words that remained in the highest category for weeks after. They were succumb and surreal. And what we've now learned is that the word surreal is the word that is looked up after every tragedy, after the Boston Marathon, after the Newtown shootings, after the suicide of Robin Williams. The most looked up word was surreal. And at that point, as a dictionary editor, I say, I hope that's a good definition. I hope it doesn't say of or relating to surrealism. But actually, the definition of surreal is a great one. It says, having the intense, irrational reality of a dream. The intense, irrational reality of a dream. And that tells us something about what people are looking for in the dictionary. They aren't just looking for spelling or pronunciation or definitions. In this case, I think they were looking for philosophy, the point of departure, the beginning of a thought. I know this also because in February, the most looked up word by far is the word love. And they're not looking up love for spelling. And we have a tiny little bit of insight into this because people write to us. Now they write through email, but we get thousands of letters, and we answer them all. And there was a letter about 20 years ago, and we don't have the original letter, but we just have the response. And the response says, I'm sorry that we cannot tell you from the dictionary how long love lasts. Because we're very good at defining words, but the deeply felt human emotions and how long they last is not something that we know anything about. And it was a serious letter, but it also tells me something. It tells me that people look up the word love, for example, again, as a point of departure, as a moment of philosophy. When Michael Jackson died, the single most looked up word was emaciated. And emaciated was the reported condition of his body by the coroner. Now, the word was looked up the most in that week of his death. It was summer of 2009. It was the most looked up word of the summer of 2009. It was the second most looked up word of the entire year of 2009. And it's an indicator of what draws us to the dictionary. It's a classic case because the most looked up words in the dictionary that aren't driven by the news are abstract words with classical roots, like emaciated, so integrity, pragmatic, paradigm, conundrum, ubiquitous. These are the words that are looked up day in and day out that pay my salary. These are words that adults feel responsible for. Now, you can also forget all of that. Two of the most looked up words in the English language are affect and effect, and that's just part of the problem of the language. But we've discovered about a year and a half ago that mobile lookups from mobile devices actually exceed lookups from the desktop computers. And what's interesting about that is we can divide the data and we can see different patterns. And so, for example, late at night, after 11 o'clock at night, we see a lot of two-letter words that are looked up, like chi, spelled Q-I, and za for pizza, spelled Z-A. So what we know is that in bar rooms and bedrooms all over America, people are playing Scrabble. And everybody knows that in order to play Scrabble well and competitively, you need a dictionary. So thank you very much.
That was great.
Thank you.
That was great. That was great. So I was telling Peter upstairs, I think everyone has a favorite word, right? My favorite word's indefatigable. It's one of those just great words, right? You almost don't have to look it up. Once you know the definition, the definition's right in the word, and it just sounds great. Sure. In journalism, we're always distilling words down, trying to get to simplify them. The SAT just dropped SAT words like phlegmatic and copacetic. These are great words. Do you worry about that?
No.
No? Why not?
Language is the most perfectly democratic marketplace there is. Languages absolutely follow rules, but they do not follow orders. So you can't tell a person that this is not the correct word to use for a certain thing. If a word gets out there, a word like blog, for example, which entered the dictionary in 3 years, because it was a word for something we had no word for. That was also true for the word AIDS. So we obviously had to put that into the dictionary.
Words.
Absolutely,
Right.
we always have to add words. And so the fact is, English is a mongrel language. We have these roots that are from different places. We have these Germanic roots and these Latin roots. I always like to remind people that at the Battle of Hastings, the French won. And they gave us as a gift their entire language, essentially, including the word language. And so that history is one of acquisition and expansion, and that's just what we do.
And it's fascinating. You have this master list of words that we're all searching for. I use Merriam-Webster every day, to look it up online, keeping you in business.
Yes.
But what words are you surprised by? We live in a politically charged time right now. I'm sure as the news changes, you mentioned 9/11, you mentioned the Boston Marathon bombings, you mentioned different events. Right now, what words are you seeing percolate into that list?
Well, right now, it's not surprising. They're very serious words. Socialism is number one.
All right.
But
is that just in Vermont? Or
no.
Okay.
But it's important to say that socialism was also number one in 2012. Oh. And what's interesting to me is I think we're good at reading data. We're not good at reading minds. I don't know why people look up words. However, I think there has been a change. I think that what we see with Bernie Sanders, for example, is the introduction of someone who is a self-described socialist at the very top of our political consciousness. That would have been impossible a generation ago, even 4 years ago, it seems to me. And I believe a word like socialist might have been used kind of as an epithet in the old days, and today it's being used as a more descriptive term, and people are curious about that. But we do see the words demagogue and fascist way up at the top right now. The word bigot and bigotry, words bigot and bigotry are very high. And so, these are unhappy words for sort of unsettled time.
How do you decide when the definition of a word has changed? I wonder, that must be an interesting time in the office, right? I mean, is there a marker? Is there a news event? Or is it just, you see it in the population? I think of words like, discrimination, racism, sexism.
Yeah, no, it happens all the time. We are called as definers. The job is called general definer, and there are two kinds of people in that job. There are lumpers and there are splitters. And I believe that you are born either one or the other.
Yeah. Can you tell what am I?
I don't know. You'd have to write a few definitions
right.
for me. But the splitters are the ones who see these things. So, for example, a colleague just today said, we don't have a definition of the word enhance that refers specifically to computer video screens. And that is obviously a sense that will be coming into the language. At the same time, I have another colleague who added a new sense of the pronoun a or a, as in a book. And now the language is 1,000 years old. And this is one of the original words in the language. And how did she find this word? But her sense, her new definition, you can go check it, is a very particular use of that word. So you could say something like, a Mr. Smith called. Means a person with this name who is otherwise unknown, right? But if you say a triumphant Mr. Smith greeted his supporters, that means it's a person who is known in one quality, but in this instance is exhibiting a different quality. That definition was not in any Webster dictionary or in the Oxford Dictionary or any dictionary of the English language until 2003. And yet we've been using it forever, so these things hang out in plain sight. So you do have to look and constantly be attentive and be a detective.
Do you want to tell a group, the audience here, what your favorite word is? I know I wasn't supposed to ask you, but come on.
It's like asking someone, a parent who's, what's your favorite child? You
All
can't,
right.
we don't do that.
I had an old journalism professor. His favorite word was alpenglow, which it defines the way sunlight hits off mountains. It's a German root, right? You can tell me what's the root for alpenglow?
As soon as you hear those compounds, you know it's German, right? It's two different. You can just you can line them up forever. One word that I love, the word that I always use as an example word when I demonstrate our app. The app works with your voice. I always use the word sesquipedalian. And anybody know what that word means? Anyone?
No.
Almost. Sesquipedalian, one who uses long words. Yeah.
Great. Peter Sokolowski, everybody. That was great, Peter. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah. How do you choose the word of the year?
The word of the year is data. The word of the year is empirical. So for us, I mean, the word of the year is done by all kinds of different publishers and groups, like the American Dialect Society, which is a terrific group of linguists who look at the events of the year and they pick a word that sort of in some way encapsulates that word that year. For us at Merriam-Webster, the benefit of having a big dictionary with something like 100 million words looked up a month, so a billion plus words looked up a year, we have this data. And we find it's much more interesting and more sort of in keeping with our descriptive mission. We describe the language in the dictionary according to the evidence that we find, and so we thought it sort of makes sense to then present that evidence back to the public as the word of the year. So this year it was, we said ism, because what I noticed is in the top 20 words, we had socialism, fascism, racism, feminism, all these isms, and so we decided that even though numerically socialism was the number one word, capitalism and communism were there, and so we just said, well, this is 7 isms out of 20, which is a remarkable thing. So that was the story we told. I like trying to tell the truth about the language.
I think the one thing, you all do 3 very different things, right? Very, very different things, but I think, the printed word and the book kind of binds them all together, right? So it seems like every week, every day we see an article that comes out that says, I remember NPR did this great story a few years ago online as an April Fool's joke. They wrote, the headline was, "Study says Americans don't read anymore." And there were 2 paragraphs, and then the 3rd paragraph said, April Fools, if you're still reading this is a joke. It was the most commented story that NPR ever did because no one read it, and they were all, going back and forth and arguing in the comments section. So we always hear, movies are going to kill the theater. The theater's still around. TV's going to kill radio. We're still here. We're doing all right. Ebooks are always, still predicted to kill the paper book. Last year, 571 million books were sold. That's up 17 million from the year before. So, Robin, what do you think? You see this firsthand every day. What's driving that group of kids to come to the Brookline Library?
Well, it's what I think a lot of us touched on. It's the stories that people need, the stories that people tell. And I will give my dad credit. As soon as I told him I was doing this tonight, he sent me a Carl Sagan quote about how the greatest invention that we ever had was writing. And that's the truth. Our way of recording and telling stories is the way to connect across time and space. And I think there's nothing that will ever stop that. The format will always change. We spend a lot of time adjusting to the format that it's being told in, but the content itself is always going to be important. We'll never stop telling ourselves stories, telling other people's stories. It's how we communicate.
Great. Todd, yes, here we go.
Well, I think that everything is an and. There's not an or that we need to make. I love chocolate. But I also love ice cream, so I'm going to and the ice cream. I'm not going to make a decision between the chocolate and the ice cream. And I think the same is true for the ebook. It can inspire people to want to look at physical books. And I do think last year they printed more physical books than any other time in history. So it is continuing to grow, and I don't see any reason that would stop at all.
Peter?
And I would just say that we still print books. We still sell books. We still sell a lot of books. It's just that that's a smaller part of our business now. It's or it's also. I think a lot of people are like me. I use the paper dictionary sometimes. I use the dictionary on a desktop computer sometimes. And I use the dictionary in my cell phone sometimes. And I love all 3.
Well, as a broadcast journalist, we're always trying to dispel myths and get at that. What will it take to overturn that myth that the book is dead or dying?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Hopefully.
Besides the beautiful arguments you just made, but for actually getting that message out.
I think the evidence is in front of us. You watch people reading around you. I mean, I spend time on my commute, usually staring at the other people on the commute to see who's reading what and why. I'm puzzled by people who do nothing. I don't understand how you do that. But I'm one of them, I think, a classic librarian. I have a paper book, I have books on my phone, I have podcasts, I have audio, I listen to everything I possibly can. So I always have a book with me in any possible form. If you don't have a book in your bag, you're usually not a librarian. But there's that sense of kind of, I need to take a book with me, even if I'm going to like a dinner and I'm going to be talking to people, but I need a book just in case. So I think there's that sense that, I see people constantly reading in all ways, and I don't think there's ever a way to judge that. I was just discussing earlier that, when we do summer reading at this point, we judge the time you spend reading, not what you spent reading. So there's an expansion of what reading is. You reading online in long form is the same as reading online as an essay or reading, anything. And I think there's so much more out there that I think it's just better, but at the same time, there's so many different voices that you're hearing too. So, I don't know.
Yeah. Todd, you want to add on to that?
That's tough to follow.
Yeah, right. So it's kind of on us. I mean, what Robin was saying, it's on us. When we go out to dinner, we should all bring books. We're kind of like walking ads for the book. Is that part of it? Should we should probably join Todd's class in bookbinding?
Well, I think there's something very tangible about a physical book. I think the reason that we remember the books that we read when we were 12 years old, and for me it was the Thunderbolt House, we can picture that book. And there was maybe a smell to that book. It might not have been a new book, but it could be a new book. Old books have, for some reason, they have their own particular, I think, wonderful smell. It activates a lot of different senses, and I think that's what makes it so memorable.
Peter, what's gonna help overturn that myth that the dictionary or books are dying?
Well, to me, it's a parallel to the myth that we always hear that language is dying, that kids today don't use the correct grammar, or they don't use a very large vocabulary. And my answer to that is that anyone who says kids today was once a kid, and that we know that Cicero, around, about 2,000 years ago, complained about kids today and their terrible Latin and the way that, and so that we know that has always existed, this kind of complaining. And linguists will tell you that there's no such thing. We don't observe any reduction. And this age of and, this age of also, exposes us to more media. And the written word and our written expression is more important today than it ever was, because that might be the only face we show a certain public. And so that your spelling counts and that your grammar counts, because you are and we are judged always and everywhere by the way we sound and the way that we write. And so our presentation of ourselves is more text-based. We are creating more text today, whether it's on our phones or at work. And therefore, we see no reduction whatsoever. We see an increase. In fact, my boss, the president of Merriam-Webster, is certain that people use dictionaries a little bit more every year in the 30 years that he's been there. And that's really gratifying. Now, with the cell phone apps, that makes it even more dramatic, because it's so easy. You've got it on your person all the time.
Great. Yeah, Robin.
One thing I will say that I think is important to remember is, if you are a reader, don't hide it. There's a stereotype about teenagers especially, that girls read for a long time, boys stop reading when they're 13. Pretty much, that's a general stereotype. But part of it comes from the fact that boys are not visible about the fact that they read. They don't read in public. They read in private. So they don't think other boys read, so they don't think it's okay. And that's a socialization that happens, whereas girls don't get that same, they're not hit with that same criticism if they read a book in public. I've also done a lot of surveys with teenagers about book covers. Like, what would they read? What would they feel comfortable other people seeing them read? Book covers have a big impact on that. So it's that kind of sense of, there's a big movement to kind of get parents to read in front of their kids, not just read to your kids, but show them that you read too. And that will help them understand that there's a whole generation of people that are reading around them, even if they don't see it all the time.
Book nerds unite. That's the message. All right, Robin, Peter, Todd, thank you all so much for being here. This was a great event. All right, and thank you all of you for being here tonight. This is great.
Those people who are going out, if they're going out, three times a week to have a meal out. They can't eat at Oya and Mentone every night, and hence the sort of rapid disappearance of the white tablecloth dining.